Recording in progress. And oh my gosh, share screen is the big green button. What am I doing? Okay, great. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and take this back up to the top.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, this is going to be a lovely chat between Madeline and I about technical direction. And if any guests pop in, they can join us. Otherwise,
Yeah, then hurry. Let's be very conversational.
yeah, otherwise it's available on the YouTubes. So welcome to Intro to Technical Direction, everyone on the YouTubes. We'll do just some brief introductions about ourselves. Madeline, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Madeline Akin. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the current technical director at Theater in the Round. Sorry, my cat's making terrible noises. I started just about 6 weeks before everything shut down for the pandemic. And then, got almost to opening up Great Expectations, and then we shut everything down, and we'll be back soon to undisclosed details. Sorry, I have to unstick my cat from the screen.
That's okay. I understand. I have 2 wiener dogs, so at any given point, if either of us just go on mute, the other one just has to cover for it.
It's true. Okay, she's fine now. Thank you for your patience.
Yes.
Anyway, I graduated from University of Northern Iowa in May 2015. Did some summer stock, and then it came up to the cities. I've been doing a lot of design work. Lots of, what other things do I do? Some education coordination. I'm a certified intermediate actor combatant through the SAFD, so I love to do that kind of thing. Lots of puppetry, prop stuff. Sometimes I do stuff on stage. I like to be all over the place and expand my skill set whenever I can.
Great. Love it. And I'm Sadie Ward. For anyone that's watching any or listening to any TRP podcasts or watching on YouTube, you've probably seen or heard me before. But I graduated from Viterbo University in 2012, and I double majored in theater studies and arts administration. I was in human resources in the theater for a number of years before I decided to go back to school to kind of strengthen my drafting skills. So I'm currently enrolled. This fall will be my last semester at MCTC in architectural drafting, and I am an assistant project manager and CAD drafter at a commercial window company. Today I was actually at the U of M today measuring windows. Fun fact. And I do quite a bit of freelance set and prop design work. I used to stage manage, but stage management kind of fell by the wayside when I was doing human resources, because I was like, this is too much of the same part of my brain to do human resources and then stage manage people. So I definitely have a stage management kind of brain. I just haven't actually stage managed a show probably since 2017. So there's that. So that's who's talking today. So we're going to start with just a broad definition of what's a technical director. So when Madeline and I were talking, we went to the Association for Community Theaters definition, and they define a technical director as the daily responsibility for the technical operations of a theater or performing arts center, including lighting, sound, set design, and construction, and coordinating necessary maintenance. He or she, I'm going to add in or they, works with a great deal of independence and exercises independent judgment in performing a wide variety of duties. It's the broadest last sentence I've ever read in my life. And I know we had some conversation, Madeline, just kind of around how that's a nice broad definition of technical directors, but there can be some variations to that depending on the theater that people work in.
Right, yeah. I feel like every space is a little bit different in terms of what the technical director needs to do, and a lot of that is based on the size of the organization. That might be something that's on the next slide, but I'm gonna get into it anyway, I guess. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, if there's a lot of people on staff in production, the technical director might handle more of the drafting, overseeing, making sure things can happen, a lot of the operational things, and they might have like a master carpenter and a whole team of production staff working underneath them. Whereas at TRP, I am the production staff, except for, of course, like costumes and that kind of thing. And so the day-to-day carpentry, painting, putting things in place, as well as drafting and making sure it can fit into that space, also falls under technical direction in at TRP.
Yeah, and I think because I think the kind of the perspective I bring to this presentation is being, and Madeline does a certain amount of freelance set design as well, but going to different theaters, I think sometimes it's important when you're getting to know a technical director exactly where that line is sometimes, because I know I've worked with some technical directors that maybe have more building maintenance duties. So they might be like, couldn't get to your drafting today because I had to fix something on the roof. And I'm like, oh, okay, got it. So it does vary quite a bit. So I think that it's always a good thing whenever you're freelancing, particularly, and getting to know not just the person that's the technical director, but like what are their jobs? Because there's kind of the core essence of what they do, but there are variations with it. And I think at TRP, our technical director also kind of meets designers where they're at, because we have kind of a range of experience when it comes to designers coming in, whether it's maybe someone who's never set design before, so maybe they need to look to the technical director for maybe a little bit more input on just how the process works, versus like I used to work at TRP when there was no technical director, so I know this space really well. It's kind of a range of experiences at TRP as well.
Right, and I think the space at TRP is so unique in terms of the layout, the way it's kind of carved into the building, and the scale and the shape and the just the particulars of the space. If someone's never designed there before, or like you said, is a new designer, then I think as a technical director, you'd anticipate a little bit more like questions to answer, things to point out to them on their way in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, excellent. Anything else you want to add on to this slide, Madeline, before I move on?
Yeah, I'll just touch on that there's, especially at TRP and other places as well, there is oftentimes an element of education in the job of a technical director, whether you are leading a volunteer crew or who might have varying, as you were saying, varying range of experiences or comfort even with power tools and materials that you use in a shop. It's good to be able to have that very human element of kind of meeting folks where they're at educationally as well.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. So just with my background in human resources, I usually think of jobs in terms of hard skills and soft skills. So I think of hard skills as like, what are the things that you can like sit down in a class and like learn, then are technical things and you can say, yes, I just know how to do this. Because I think really great technical directors have that beautiful blend of like hard skills and soft skills. Because I think there's lots of technical things a technical director needs to know.
It's a
but
very
I think
technical job.
very technical. Well, and especially in a world when you look at someplace like the Guthrie that has like automation as well, as technology develops, the job of a technical director only gets more complicated over time in some ways. But just in terms of hard skills, there's drafting and then like interpreting drafting that comes from a designer. And I don't know if you want to go through this like point by point or how you kind of feel about it.
Sure, yeah. Just to kind of give a quick overview of each.
Yeah.
As far as drafting and interpreting drafting goes, sometimes designers will want to bring in their own drafts that they've done if they do draft. Sometimes they'll bring in, you might expect a designer to bring in renderings and some measurements, and then you have to kind of interpret from there and draft it into your space. You might, like, I currently hand draft and I'm working on learning computer drafting, but in a smaller space like TRP that leaves a little bit of wiggle room. By the time we're back in, I'll be good to go on Vectorworks. But you also need to be able to interpret other people's drafting, because obviously there's different styles between different folks. You need to make sure everything matches up in terms of the footprint of the space, and then it's all feasible as well. A lot of the job of the technical director is taking the designer's idea and saying, okay, you figure out the what, now I'm going to figure out the how. and make it work and make it safe and make it in budget. Ideally, you can do all three by the time the show opens. But that also means having a wide range of skills in order to make those things happen. Carpentry, so the typical like stage carpentry in terms of what stock sizes are, what different conventions in building a flat or building a platform versus furniture. You might be reupholstering something or putting different legs on a thing, and you might be altering existing carpentry that might not be purpose built for theater. You got to paint, you got to weld. That's not something that we would use as much at TRP just because of the space itself, but we do have welding capacity.
And I just want to throw in there that usually my perspective is I usually don't expect a technical director to paint unless it's like base painting or black. I think it's like an extra shiny bonus if you have a technical director that is like scenic paint level painter. So I would say one thing that we've said in our props presentation is that like there's no two props people that are exactly alike. It's the same thing with technical directors. It's like there's this large range of skills and people might be in varying spots with them. So
yeah, definitely. It's kind of like if you think of like different dials that are turned up or down on each of these different categories for different people and the different needs in different spaces. Having a passing knowledge at least of each so you can speak the same language as a designer is the main important thing. To jump back in, you need to know rigging conventions because if you're hanging stuff over people's heads, you got to do it safely. At TRP, there's not enough headspace that you might expect to be like really doing anything crazy in terms of like flying, or there's no counterweight system. So the rigging is going to be specific to whatever space you're in. And also in a larger house or in a big proscenium space where there is a counterweight system, you're going to also as technical director be working with the people who are coming to service your rigging and making sure everything is good to go. So there's lots of varying degrees of rigging skill as well. That's a whole nother area of certification that a person can get into, especially if they're doing union work. You need to have some knowledge of lighting and sound, at least enough to speak to the lighting and sound boards that are in your space, so you can communicate with your designers.
I also think
any kind of, sorry, go ahead.
I also think that some of the lighting and sound experience comes from like, oh God, the soundboard just went down. Who can help? So it's not necessarily like knowing like the design aspects of it so much as like the technical functional part of like, this is the system, this is how it turns on. That's usually what I kind of think of in terms of that level of knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. Like sound is one of those areas that like I don't know anything about sound design, but can I plug things in and probably troubleshoot if I needed to? Yeah. And that's just, another level of where different people's dials are set at. Some technical directors might be coming from a sound background first and have more knowledge in specific areas. But also the technology in terms of lighting and sound specifically are changing all of the time. So some spaces are really, keep up on top of that. Some spaces have older systems, and it depends on your designer too, what people prefer to work with. Yeah.
Stage tricks are also something that I always kind of, depending on the level of stage trick, will get that technical director's brain in there. I'm just thinking like there was one season of TRP where I somehow designed two different shows, each where a table had to break, but they had to break differently. And I think that this was before we had a technical director, but I just remember being like, why do I have two shows that have breakable tables this season? But that one just kind of strikes me as like that would have been like me go to being like, what are your thoughts? Just to
that would have been a really great collaborative moment had we both been there at the time to figure that out.
Well, one, we just like straight up cut it in half, and then we had like a doily on the top of it, so it just completely hid the line. And then we like made a little like nook or whatever and had a piece of balsa wood so that when the actors snapped it, the balsa wood was enough to keep it up.
Yeah, and then you still get that nice sound when it breaks too.
Yeah, I was pretty proud of that solution. So and then getting on to soft skills, I know that creative problem solving is something that we both love and appreciate. So I'll let you take it away on that one.
Okay. Creative problem solving is my favorite part of most any job that I've done. Um, Partly because like it's always something that'll need to happen, and also because it just keeps things interesting. Every day is going to be a little bit different. In any job where you are just kind of troubleshooting, putting out fires every now and then, not literally. And
Not
figuring
literally.
out, okay, well, we have this and we need to have that. How do we get from A to B? How do we make this work? Um, and just kind of combining all the different skills you might have or different experiences a person might have coming from different parts of their life or previous jobs, kind of makes for uh, interesting and different solutions from everyone. And I think, I don't know, I feel like that's like half of the like theatrical process is just figuring out how do we tell this story, how do we do this thing. um yeah.
Yeah. Next on the list, we have artistic interpretation. And this for me personally is always something that I always try, because like anytime that you're doing a production with a technical director, you always end up with like those last minute like punch list items, right? And I always like to kind of understand where my technical director is at in kind of artistic interpretation, because there's some, when you're divvying up that punch list, there's some things where it's like, no, I'm going to do that, versus like, no, I know you have a good eye, so you go ahead and do it. I can't think of an exact example right now, but um, I know that this is something that I always just like to kind of have a sense of. And I think with these soft skills, these are the kinds of things that you learn over time with experience. I don't think that these are the things that you can just like take a class and know, right? Like drafting, you
Yeah.
can like take a class and like know how to use a computer program. Artistic interpretation and creative problem solving, that's a little bit more life based.
Yeah,
So,
lots of trial and error there. I feel like a good example for artistic interpretation is if like I'm the technical director and if a designer came in and they said like, "Oh, I'd like a wood grain on this floor." And I was like, "Oh," and if I were to ask like, "Okay, what kind of wood grain would you like?" And they're like, "I don't really know." I might, based on the script and based on the other elements of their design, I might paint them up a couple different samples based on what I think they might be going for. Um, and try to figure out from there what they're looking at, and what they want for the rest of the space. So
mm-hmm,
yeah, a lot of times there is that sense of like, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what they're going for. Um, Even if they haven't explicitly told you, I want exactly this color of paint layered on that, layered on this. Sometimes you do have to kind of interpret.
mm-hmm, yeah. And then we have communication and interpersonal skills. And I definitely can think of some situations where I have been in a situation where I've been like, that's not how we communicate with each other, but okay. Um, but I think that the technical director can also, there's like the one-on-one communication and interpersonal, but I think the technical director is also a person that can help set the tone for an overall like production and an overall venue, just because like the technical director can be so like involved in every production, right, that they can really they have a lot of influence on the overall culture of things.
Yeah, and I feel like there's not anyone that a technical director isn't usually going to be interacting with at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so being able to, like you're saying, kind of set the tone and set the precedent and say, and kind of have your order of operations or your priorities in line in terms of what everybody needs and how you communicate and how people learn to expect to communicate with you. I think is really important to not only like the HR of it all in terms of like making sure everyone has what they need and is feeling good about it, but also just making sure things can run efficiently. If someone knows that like if for some reason I like didn't build in breaks to answer emails so that like I could answer questions from designers or like didn't do, if I wasn't communicating efficiently, there's a lot of things that could get held up in a production because people need answers to their questions. And usually the technical director is the person who has to, if not answer them directly, at least has to be in that thread of
Mm-hmm.
answering.
Yeah. Next on the list, we have diplomacy, because I think when I've talked with some technical directors, they sometimes feel like the no police, or, like the no captain of like, no, we can't do that. So I think that instead of just being like, no, we can't do that, I like to think of it as diplomacy, because I know as a designer, sometimes I am like, can we do this? Like kind of knowing that we like can't, or like maybe shouldn't do it. And so like sometimes like the technical director like is the one to like hopefully tactfully be like, no, we can't do that, or be like, we can do it, but we might have to compromise on something else if we're going to do this over here. So, and I
Yeah, you
think that,
really have to keep kind of all of those. You have to kind of keep that objectivity and keep the like core important kind of missions of the production in order, you know?
yeah,
Like I like in terms of like I'm always going to say no to something that compromises safety,
yeah,
even if it's really cool. I'll be like, no, we can't do that, but maybe instead we can do this. So being able to offer up alternatives is always a good way, I feel, to be, even if you're not a technical director in most aspects of a production or life. I think being able to say either, if you can't say yes and, being able to say no but
mm-hmm.
will get you far.
Yeah. Um, and I think that that goes beyond just designers too, because I know I have been in some situations where like a technical director and like the director of a production have, I'm thinking of one instance where like we were in a production meeting and the technical director and the director were just like going at it over this one thing, and I'm like, I have no skin in this game. I am fine with either option, but clearly this is very this big thing for you two. I was like, this is the opposite of diplomacy right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it goes beyond just like the designer relationship, and can, yeah, the technical director works with so many people. And you've mentioned teaching, I think, a little bit already, but I'm wondering if you have anything else you want to kind of expand on that in terms of soft skills.
Yeah, just that I think something that I've learned between like being a TA in my shop in college all the way through to like teaching various age groups and people with different levels of skill or comfort level until now. I think um, being able to like have some stock things that you can return to with anyone that you're teaching, and being able to like really make sure that you're teaching people who might learn in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Some people want to like hear an instruction. Some people want to see something done. Some people want you to watch them do it correctly a few times before they're comfortable with you walking away. I think being able to and prepared to kind of to meet folks where they are, is going to get you so much further. And also just being able to be just kind when you're when you're teaching folks, because sometimes someone might walk into your shop being like, I've never volunteered here before, and I've also never picked up a drill, and the sound of it and the fact that it might torque my wrist a little bit scares me. And being able to come in and be like, that's cool, here's how we can minimize that risk and make sure that you feel comfortable. um, and there's always something for someone to be working on, even if they have like a hard no on being on ladders or something like that, that's fine. um, I think just being able to make people feel welcome and like they can learn something and do something that maybe they didn't know that they could learn how to do is one of my favorite aspects of the job.
And I think one thing, not that I've taught in a technical directing situation, but just having assistants and having led paint crews, I think one of the critical skills of teaching is for yourself learning how to explain the same thing in different ways so it lands on different people. And
Mm-hmm.
that to me, I've always said, I know I fully understand something when I can teach it to someone, because like I knew that I could teach wood graining when I could teach it to anyone that walks in the door. So and then we've got time management and people management.
Mm-hmm.
Just because there's so many moving parts to technical direction, not only just in like one production, but then when you start doing back-to-back productions, there's so many things to keep track of that you just inherently have to you have to be able to manage time.
Yeah. So much of technical direction is just allocating resources, whether that resource is lumber, time, or people, and knowing what needs to happen in what order in order for everything to get done, and just keep people from being like stressed out about it. I think even if you can't, I think a lot of people in terms of time management might expect you to have to like have a perfect memory for when everything is and what everything is, but I think everyone has their own system. Personally, I need to be able to write everything down, and I need to be able to have a calendar that I can reference quickly visually, because I don't remember dates that well on my own. But if I can like write everything out and kind of map it out and see what everything is, then I can not only remember it, but also explain it to others if they're like, oh, how much time do we have to do this thing? And it has to be like, well, they're in the space on this day, so platforms need to be on that day, which means we need to get the lumber order in on that day. Um, Being able to make sure the crew you're working with also shares your priorities and sense of time management is helpful as well. Yeah, but there's a lot of different plates to juggle.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else you want to add on this slide before I move on?
I don't think so.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but just kind of the relationships that a technical director develops kind of throughout a production. There's kind of always the one-to-one, like technical director is always going to be talking with a scenic designer. There's the other designers as well, but usually technical direction, that primary designer relationship is with the scenic designer. And then there's, whatever other artistic producing, theater leadership, whatever that relationship looks like, because usually a technical director is on staff working with contracted or, freelancing, regularly changing designers.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's kind of, designers are a little bit more kind of short-term, kind of revolving door, constantly changing. But then there's also relationships that you have to maintain, like any place you work for multiple years. How do you sustain long-term working relationships like that? So I don't know if you have anything else to add to that relationship.
I think you summed it up really well, actually.
Thanks. We'll go on to the next slide then. Artistic to execution. And I think this is, to me, what I'm always like maybe most impressed by with my technical directors that I work with, because sometimes I'm like, I have this idea and it's going to be great. I don't know how it's going to happen, but this is the idea. So it's really that idea of making ideas into reality, that, and on budget too, that is also the great part. So
yeah, I feel like it's more of that creative problem solving and more of that like kind of putting a puzzle together of building a set and kind of bringing all the different elements together as a technical director that kind of makes it a fun challenge and a different challenge every time. Sometimes your director, your designer might really not have, depending on like how experienced they are, or just the way that their own brain works. I've worked with directors who are like, I know the vibe that I want, but I don't know the words to say anything specific about what I want. And so when I've worked with directors like that as a scenic designer, but you have to approach it more as like, okay, well, based on the script, I know that these are the hard things that we need. We know that there's this kind of scene, there's this kind of scene. We know there's these stage tricks that are in the script. Do we want those? How important are they? And then kind of breaking it down and getting into like, oh, do you mean this or do you mean this? Like what kind of tone are you looking for here? That I think as a senior designer, and I think it bleeds into technical direction as well, is a big part of it.
Yeah. And I think that some of my most fulfilling relationships with technical directors, because like as a designer, you'll work at a theater a couple times and you'll get to know a technical director and how they work and things like that. But I usually think of my most fulfilling ones are collaborative relationships with technical directors. So if I'm a designer and I can't figure something out, but I'm like, I know I can have a conversation with this person maybe before I go back to the director. Or like sometimes there's a thing where it's like, okay, the director really wants this. I have no idea how to do this. Like, what are your ideas? Because then it feels more like a partnership rather than like, here, take care of my list of things to do person. Like that doesn't feel good.
Yeah. And two heads are always better than one. And a lot of times as a technical director, like Sometimes there's so many things that you're juggling that you can kind of get lost in the weeds, and you need that other collaborator, whether it's a scenic designer, um, who to come in and be like, oh, could we just do it this way? And then like, oh yeah, actually we could. That's a lot simpler. Um, to kind of cut through all the extra noise of it. But yeah, being able to collaborate is and collaborate well is always a better time for everybody.
Yeah. So with a technical director, I always think of, there's like different kinds of planning. There's like planning that's specific to a production, but usually a technical director has like a wider lens because they're able to look at like, I'm doing this show, and then this show. So you're in the middle between these shows. So I usually think a technical director gets started on work once, season selection or season announcement, whatever any theater does. Like a technical director is going to sit down with a calendar. I don't know a technical director that doesn't do this, but like sit down with a calendar and like lay out the build weeks so that you can like lay out all the deadlines for designers. I think you talked a little bit about this when we were prepping on this a little bit too.
Yeah, I think I love a good Google Calendar. I love anything that you can kind of move around as you need to. I think knowing there's always the hard deadline of a show opening. So finding points before that to like set yourself up for success, and especially as you get into a season, if you're like, oh, I know that once I'm 3 weeks into this build, I should have this from this designer, or I should have like this planned for the next build, and kind of having those things that you put in place for yourself as kind of guideposts will help you balance the workload in general. If you know that like, oh, this is going to be a really heavy build week for the show that opens in 3 weeks, so I'm probably not going to have time to draft whatever this is, so I should do that the week before. Is I feel like that in of itself is a job. But if you can, get into a good groove with it and do it well, and manage these things, and keep all your lists where you need them to be, then you can really keep things running smoothly.
And I think sometimes when a technical director, why do I keep saying that? Director can give me that context, it also helps me understand, like, don't talk to them this week. Like
don't bother me. I'm doing this other thing. Yeah.
Just don't even send the email because I will not read it. Because I can also tell in some theater situations, like I'm thinking of some venues that have like multiple or some theaters that have like multiple venues. I can tell when the attention is like, all right, you're up to bat, and you're like, okay, I'm ready. Like you're like, spend some time being like, I hope you didn't forget about me, and it's like, oh no, we're ready now. Okay, you were right. You were working on the other show. It just helps. I think that goes back to kind of the communication piece that we were talking about too. So before a design happens, and to me, this was something I had to look to you a lot, Madeline, because I'm like, I know what I do as a scenic designer before I have a design, but I don't know what the technical director does with us. I don't know what they do until I show up. So I'm just going to let you handle this slide.
Yeah, so before, whether I'm designing or technical directing or doing anything else, I'm always going to read the script and get familiar with what things are specified, what things are not specified, but that are like implied. Get a sense of the movement of the show. How many actors are there going to be? How much, especially in a space like TRP where like the traffic patterns and the size of the space are very specific. Like how if you've got 13 actors, probably you're not going to want a lot of big scenic units because they're going to need to move through the space. You want to get a sense of environment about it. You want to know just kind of the bare bones of what you can start building off of. I try not to put too many expectations on what I think the designer might bring, but I like to kind of have a sense of what they might be going for, so I can get a sense of like, oh, I know this designer really likes to put a whole bunch of like weird shaped platforms in a space. We probably won't be able to use much stock for it, so that'll probably be a bigger build.
That's not me. That's not me. I don't like
That's
virtual
not you.
platforms. That's not me.
Or like, I know that this is going to be a really like time consuming paint situation where they might be in more, they might not be, you know, whatever it is. Um, to kind of give yourself a sense of the scale of what you're going to be building. And then just knowing, like, I see we put like how action packed is the show. Is it something where like you're going to have to build it in such a way so that the actors aren't breaking it? Which isn't to say any, you know, to talk poorly of actors. I've been the actor that like is running into stuff many a time and had to be like, oh man, how can I like not give the technical director more work to do. But knowing like what people's traffic patterns are going to be, is there a table that needs to be standable as well as just like putting props on it? Am I going to need to reinforce a couch? You know, knowing, are there going to be stage tricks? Do things need to pop out of walls? You know, what's going on here? Knowing what kind of show and what you're dealing with is kind of the next step for me. And then knowing what kinds of materials, what's in stock, and what the timeline of the production is, so you can set yourself up for success, make your build calendar reasonable, always building in extra time because you're always going to need it. You might have a day where you're expecting a bunch of volunteers and then none of them show up. Or you might have a day where you're not expecting volunteers and 5 of them show up and you need to make sure that there's things for them to do. Just knowing as much as you can ahead of time without jumping to conclusions is my pre-design checklist.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And then at the point where you receive the design from said set designer, because I usually think of it as a set designer as me being like, I'm physically or maybe like sending you a big email with the stuff and I have done my job.
Yeah, the package
at least initially
over.
Yeah,
I'm receiving it, I'm looking at it. Yeah, I think you have a really good point in the slide of setting mutual expectations, and I think that's part of good communication with the scenic designer as well, in terms of maybe there's someone who has sent you the whole thing drafted and like paint elevations and like all of those things, or maybe there's someone that sent you like a few renderings and wants to work with you on like some of the drafting stuff or something like that. Having the sense of like, all right, well, this is going to take more time on your part, or I'm going to have to take this much time before I can get back to you about X, Y, and Z to figure out what we can and can't do that you've designed, is really important. And having good communication and making sure you're both on the same page about that is a big part of that first kind of day of reading through everything and making sure it's doable. I'm always going to be looking for anything that is moving, if it's on casters or if it is hung or if it's practical, because that means that I'm probably going to be working potentially a little more in depth with the sound or lighting team. If there's any real food, that's a whole thing as well, which like would fall sometimes into props, but also is going to affect what I'm doing. If someone has to spill a jug of something all over something else, I'm going to make sure it's got the right coating on it so it's easy to clean up and doesn't stain over time. I'm just making sure any of those kind of like more in depth, anything that's interacted with essentially, is covered. You know about it. And then I'm going to start asking. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say also for me, one thing as a designer, I usually try and do before I do like the handover of like, here's everything, is that kind of initial concept ideas kind of pass off, because I don't want to spend all this time like falling in love with a show if I'm like, oh, I probably can't have all of those scenic elements. I need to cut one. Why did I spend all that time designing that? So I think that that's also kind of, that goes back to, I think, setting mutual expectations a little bit too. Just in terms of hopefully everyone is kind of moving in that same direction. I think as you're talking about like moving elements, like those are sometimes the things where I'm like, how do you feel about this if I just like throw this your way? And hopefully like with a technical director, there's some kind of like, well, something like that will take, half of your build. So keep that in mind while you're designing the other elements. It's like, okay, that's good perspective. I'll keep that in mind while I'm designing the other small doodads. So
yeah, reminding people of time and budget is always a part of it. Making sure that like, hey, just so you remember, this doorway is this wide, so don't design a table that's this wide because I'm going to change it.
Yeah. And
is
oh, go for it. Yeah.
oh, I don't know what I was going to say next. You go
Oh,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, and hopefully there is a point where there is some kind of sense of like, okay, these are the final designs. Now we're moving forward with this. Because I think there's kind of like initial concepting, maybe some like paper sketches, but then like the handoff of like,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
right,
If you
here
can
it
like
is.
walk through the whole, if it, depending on, of course, like pandemic stuff, like if you can be in person and like flip through every single page of the draft for the final design and be like, cool, we both understand this. I know that this is where you want that. And like talk through any like potential surprises that you might anticipate. Or if you're like, this is going to be complicated, we'll come back to that later, or we need to figure out the details of this now because it's going to be expensive. I think yeah, you're right. There's definitely like levels and steps of receiving that design or working with the scenic designer before things are finalized and they cannot change anything else because there's not the time for it.
Yeah. And then we get into starting the build, which is always the fun and terrifying part.
Yeah, I feel like there's always that like, well, this is the first cut I'm making for this platform on this thing. Um, that it's like, all right, it feels like you're pushing off a ship, you know? Here
Yeah.
we go. We don't know where it's going to end, but we've started this voyage. Uh, yeah, you're going to be making sure you have your build calendar set so that you know how many people to expect when. If you are, uh, planning a day to draft the next thing, it can't be the same day that you have a bunch of volunteers because you're going to need to be with them. Um, you're going to need to get your lumber or any other orders in time, especially like, I feel like, especially coming back into a production schedule now, we're going to have to give longer times for things to be sourced. Because if you're ordering something that's not local, if it's not something you can go pick up, if you're like, I need this particular kind of bulb for this thing, you're going to need to give it more time because there's a chance that it'll take longer to ship to you. And that is just something you have to build into your schedule. Kind of like we talked about before, getting any paint samples going. Furniture that you're going to be pulling, buying, renting, maybe adapting. Um,
And I think one
getting
thing
all of
I'll
those.
add with furniture too is kind of getting maybe rehearsal furniture ready and final furniture. Like that can be like a two-phase process because sometimes it's in rehearsal that you're like, oh, that's how we're using that chair. Oh, okay, great. So I think that I usually think of that as kind of like a two-step process. So
True, yeah, I've definitely been the recipient of that email where it's like, the rehearsal table you gave us is this kind of table, but what we need is this kind of table. And it's like, oh, cool. Like now I know that it's that kind of table, and that won't work in rehearsal because of this bit of stage action that you're doing. Um, yeah, being able to get some of those specific things sorted early and make sure folks have what they need to help them out down the line
mm-hmm.
is crucial.
And then setting expectations with the stage manager or director around rehearsal reports, because I think that's kind of exactly what you're talking about in terms of like receiving an email of like, oh, actually this table needs this. Because like for me there's always a mental shift in a production of like once we start to rehearsal, because like sometimes depending on the production, sometimes I'm like not going to bed till I can read the rehearsal report so I can know what happened. Hopefully it's nothing, but I'm gonna know. But also I think understanding like just because it came out in the rehearsal report doesn't mean it can be fixed by tomorrow, or appear by tomorrow. I think is just something around setting expectations too. And I think sometimes I usually think of that as like the set designer and TD like tag teaming things sometimes. Like there's some rehearsal reports where I'm like, that is so not me. That is TD's thing. And then there's other things where I'm like, oh, that's me. I will respond to this right now.
Yeah,
Just
and
so
there's
that,
some things that people like to receive information in different ways. Like for me personally, I would rather get an email with a batch of things that need done, than like be receiving text throughout the day. Um, just because that's a more efficient way to communicate with me. Or if if something is happening and happening and happening, but it's never in the rehearsal report and no one ever tells me, I won't know and it won't get fixed. So just setting that expectation of like letting the stage manager or director know like, hey, let me know what things are highest priority in the rehearsal report? Like, what things do you really want done by tomorrow if they can be? What things are not as crucial until we get into the space?
Mhm. Yeah, and then also as we're moving through the build, I think that there's a certain amount of like communication with like the other designers too. And I think that this can be like very production specific, depending on the needs of the production of what that communication looks like.
Yeah, true. I think especially as you get into like paint and finish, really being on top of communicating with the lighting and costume designers is going to be a big deal. Because if I put like a high gloss finish on that table and the lighting designer didn't know that it was going to bounce that much light, that's going to affect what they're doing. Or if I've got this crazy pattern on that wall that does weird things to people's eyeballs when it is combined with someone's costume, that's something we're going to need to know earlier if possible.
Yep. And then also sharing spaces with other designers as you move through. Because I know there's been some days where I'm like painting in the dark at TRP and I signed up for that. And then also creative problem solving at every step of the way. Tech, an ideal world, you do have just that final punch list and you're just working through it on tech. That's the ideal world, I think. So.
Yep. Yeah, that's like, if everything goes to plan, I can just cross things off my list as I do them and then they'll all be done. There's always surprises. You're going to find maybe something that's been working just fine suddenly doesn't work. And like a door needs a new hinge, or like something breaks that you would not expect to break, or something like that. As long as you can, kind of as we've noted here, avoid scope creep.
Such a good term.
Sometimes.
I love this term. Scope creep.
Yeah, right?
Love it.
I've worked in the past a number of times as a scenic designer for directors who, like, at the very last minute were like, actually, could we do this, and this? For various reasons that I won't get into. Sometimes I've been asked to do things very last minute that were not part of the original plan. There's not time for those things. Or they're like, well, as long as we're doing this thing, can we add this? But the thing they want to add is like infinitely more complicated somehow. And being able to like set those boundaries and be like, nope, here's the things on the list. I can give you that, but I can't give you this other thing. Let me know which one you want. Understanding why they might want things or not want things at the last minute by seeing a run of the show in the space. Sometimes you won't know until then exactly how something is going to work. Or how it's being used, both either because maybe it hasn't been relevant in a rehearsal report, or maybe it's just slightly different than you imagined, or maybe it's just been communicated in such a way that you expected something different. Being able to say, oh, they're both trying to go through that door at the same time. No wonder they were asking for this. Gives you that extra level of understanding and ability to communicate more clearly about everything that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Also in tech, I usually think of there being kind of like that tag team nature of like with your technical director of like, all right, I'm going to be in the morning and you're going to watch the show and update the punch list, or, figuring out what that expectation of schedule is around tech. Cause there's been some techs where I'm like, okay, didn't request any PTO for this show. So hope we get everything done. But then there's some shows where I'm like, well, I requested Monday off. So this is the day we've got to get like these things because I'll be in the space kind of a situation. Because there's always final details in every tech, painting things black, getting sealant, final set dressing, always cleaning. Always cleaning.
Yeah. And sometimes those things take longer than you expect. Sometimes you can knock a bunch of them out real quick if you find an efficient way to do it. But if you don't leave yourself time to do the final details and not like put that extra like little level of polish on it, it's going to look unfinished.
Yeah, I always like for myself, I always like to have this like mental rule of like everything is done by Tuesday dress. So Wednesday I can clean paint cans in the shop while the show is running. In an ideal world, it doesn't always work that way. So then there's show maintenance. So kind of like rehearsal reports shift into show reports, which like usually you kind of like, depending on the production, you kind of know what you're like watching for or not. In every production, it's like, oh, that broke? Huh, okay. So
yeah, I always just hope to not see anything for me to put on my to-do list in a show report And inevitably something comes up, like you're saying, something surprising breaks, or there's scuffs on the floor that you need to touch up a section. Yeah, but rehearsal reports, I expect to see things to add to my list. Show reports, I'm like, oh, I hope everything's still working the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, I think at TRP, touching up the floor, if it's a high action show, is a little bit more critical than some other theaters where maybe, because at TRP, like the floor is the biggest scenic element.
Everyone sees it.
Yeah, Treasure Island and Beau's Stratagem are two shows that I've designed that come to mind where I like had to touch up the floor because by like closing week, I'm like, there's nothing left to that paint job.
And at TRP specifically too, everyone is much closer to the floor than in a bigger house.
Yeah.
So like they can really, people can pick up on small details. So
Well,
if you like to paint a floor, you're in the right place.
Yeah, and you have your audience walking across the space. So I usually think in the winter, like usually most of the time, like Salt has like, there's enough lobby to walk through that you're not talking about like a lot of salt in the space, but it's something that I think of, you know, differently, like in terms of like the summer is humid and like I have seen that floor shift. Even I had one show where it was so humid that the spike tape was pulling paint off the floor and I was like, this is not a problem I was anticipating right now.
Yeah.
So that was an experience, but and then strike. Part of the key to strike is to plan. Always plan. Because I think that there's always kind of like you built it in an order, so it should come apart in an order.
Yeah, and sometimes usually by then you're in the build for your other show. So you want to make sure people aren't just putting things in your way for the next day as they're striking. You know, if you're like, oh, I know that we're going to reuse that lumber 2 days from now, so please put it over here so I know where to find it. Being able to have that plan and to clearly explain the hows and the whys of your plan to people going in. And this is something we got into a lot in our volunteer crew chat as well. But as long as you as the technical director know what all the moving parts are, know what needs to go where, and are prepared to be answering questions and directing folks more than you're doing yourself. If you can be okay with those things and still get what you need done, you'll probably be okay.
Yeah, and I always think of safety having to be the first priority with tech because what takes 3 weeks to build can come down in 3 hours. And sometimes you have people that are not always, you know, they don't have a carpentry background to be aware of things, but you do need people to help, right?
It's true. Not every job is something you should be using a sledgehammer for. And strike is one of those things. Or just having, you know, one dedicated person who's like, I can't do this X, Y, or Z, but if they can like roll a magnet stick around and make sure no one steps on hardware, rad. Yeah. And being able to like give people the tools they need to strike safely and to not get that sense of urgency and rushing, and just making sure people know like we're going to be methodical. Here's the order things are happening in. Here's the priorities. If we don't get to X, Y, and Z, but the space is clean and people are safe and no one's hurt, then we'll be okay.
Great. So if anyone has any questions, you can email us at TRP at info at theaterintheround.org.
I think info at theaterintheround.org.
That's always a solid one to go for. So if you have questions on technical direction, maybe you want to learn how to be a technical director and want to spend some time with Madeline at TRP, we would encourage that.
Yeah, come hang out in my shop. I'll teach you to do stuff.
Yeah, or even if it's not technical direction, there's lots of opportunities to like show up for carpentry or paint calls and kind of figure out how the technical director does it without taking on the whole experience too. So excellent. Thanks, everyone.